afternoon, everyone, and thank you for participating in this session called Working Tomorrow. Our way of looking at work changed due to the lockdown because of COVID, but more structurally, people's aspirations, including those of young people, is changing, looking for meaning, trying to find better work-life balance, looking for more freedom in the relationship with their employer. So very interesting questions that have not necessarily to have answers by companies or economists or civil society. So we're going to be talking about that today at the Rencontres Économiques with Thierry DEREZ, who is the CEO of Alexandre FRETTI, who's the Director General of Malta. We're also remotely with Sergei GURIEV, who's a renowned economist and was recently put at the head of Sciences Po research, and François HOMMERIL, who's the president of the CGC, and Laurent BLANCHARD, who's the Director General of CEGID, they're specialized in software, management software. So to begin with, I'm going to ask Maya BACACHE-BEAUVALLET, who's a professor at Télécom Paris and a member of the Cercle Télécom, and you will begin the debate. So working tomorrow, that's a real challenge as a roundtable discussion. To anticipate work in the future, we have to have a perspective on the future that's awaiting us. And in the last few years, all projects have been forbidden to us practically. So we're going to try to run this debate with you today, and it's my difficult task to ask questions that economists ask when they talk about work in the future. If we want to summarize the situation, there are 5 main questions that have occupied us for the last 10 years. And I'm not going to go into all 5 of them today in this very short time that I have, but I'll send you to the framework document that was presented in the plenary session. I'd like to develop a few points that will open the debate that will take place now. I'd like to begin with the phrase from Camus that is very timely today, which says, "Without work, life dies. But in a job without a soul, your life is put out." So you don't only need a job with what it provides, but there's a real demand today to have jobs with meaning, that motivate, with a social interest and with social integration. This is the debate that we're going to have between us this afternoon. There's the first challenge that economists have looked at on work in the future is the future situation without work? We're looking at a situation between capital and work, replacing people by digital tools and robots, by artificial intelligence. This debate is quite ripe, mature today. And we know that the substitution is not one against the other, but it certainly entails a modification in the tasks involved in each job. All of our jobs will be modified. We won't just have jobs that are being replaced, humans replaced by robots. And I'd like to talk about 2 very well-known research papers. One by Simuglu, one of the main economic researchers on this topic today, who has demonstrated that there's a negative effect of robotization on the general level of employment, but the effect is quite marginal still. There's other interesting work done by Philippe Aguillon and his co-authors. Philippe is with us today, and that indicate the opposite. There's a positive effect from robotization and digitalization. The positive effect comes from increased gains in competitiveness in the companies who are making the digital transformation, and in the end, it leads to a positive effect on employment in those companies. So that's the first general topic concerning the substitution of capital versus work in classic economic terms, or the digitalization of employment today. The second debate, also quite mature as a research topic, we talk about the polarization of the labor market. How does digital impact employment amongst workers? It's unequal, and some authors say that technical progress is often biased. It's biased in favor of people who have the competency, who have the training, qualification to take ownership of the technical innovations. So digital is going to be profitable to those who have the skills to understand it. What is new in the digital world that we didn't anticipate, that is a real revolution, is the polarization. Digital will also serve will serve the qualified amongst us and will lead to a polarization of the labor market. On one hand, we'll have very qualified, well-paid people. On the other hand, we'll have unqualified people who are not well-paid at all, but who have a job. And the losers of this polarization is the middle class. In the middle class, it goes beyond just economics, but the middle class is the basis of our social democracies. So this can explain some of the political challenges that we're observing today because of this economic and political polarization. I'll conclude on these two traditional points to talk about more timely points for our discussion. Firstly, the development of work on digital platforms. This is going to be an important topic this afternoon. Is the work on platforms qualified? Is it piecemeal work, or is it liberating work? For work in the future, we're going to talk a lot about remote working. We've all experienced this, and things have radically changed with COVID on the consequences of remote working, but also for the people who benefit from remote working. There's an extreme inequality amongst employees, those that benefit from remote working and those who suffer from it because of deintegration. And my last point, and I'll finish with that, the most important and worrisome point of what's going on today and what's announced for the future is what we've called the Great Resignation. People, qualified people, white-collared workers in their 30s and 40s who are withdrawing from the labor market, looking for more meaning, looking for motivation, or simply looking for a change of life. Does COVID explain this on its own? I don't think so. I think this movement had started prior to COVID, but certainly COVID has boosted it. I know I went very quickly, but I'm now going to hand the floor to our four speakers who will give a more operational and practical point of view on the points that I just laid out. Thank you, Maya BACACHE-BEAUVALLET. The debate is now going to begin, and we'll start with you, Thierry DEREZ. How do you observe these evolutions today? What can you say about the value of work? Firstly, hello, everyone. Thank you for dealing with the rigors of the weather to assist or to participate in this debate. Let me remind you of a few notions, a few ideas. We don't want to work. The research that we've been carrying out for centuries now shows that people want to work as little as possible. We're having a break. If I go back to the work of Marshall Salins, firstly, we had the hunter-gatherer populations. They did what they could. But when we look at the time spent on work by these populations, it represented 2 to 3 hours per day. That's what we all dream of. There are constraints, of course. You have to accept to move around. You have to accept the moving with the seasons, moving with animals. And most of humanity then became sedentary. And as of that point, we always tried to see how we could avoid working. The first discovery, allowing people not to work, was slavery. We remember very ancient societies in Greece and Rome, where those who left us their testimony are those who were not working. Those who were really working, we can't hear their voices. We can't read what they think because their ability to express themselves was non-existent. And only those who were lucky enough not to work could leave a trace of their lives that we can use. So this is a long approach that consists in not wanting to work And you'll see where I'm heading to. Perhaps the questions that we're dealing with today, because of the crises that you spoke about, are questions that are quite old ones, traditional, where we have to just imagine new answers. For example, will robots and artificial intelligence be our new slaves? Will they be able to replace an important part of our production force to allow more and more people not to work? That's an ideal. Why not? What we see today through our aspiration to have to live different things at different time, balance between work life and personal life, the appearance a few centuries ago of the value of work. All of this is being challenged today. It's being challenged based on questions that come from anxiety. These questions are very anxious ones because we live in a period of the history of humanity in which there are lots of threats that are being proposed to us. There's the nuclear threat. We can destroy ourselves. There's the climate threat and the traditional threats such as war, famine, problems in supply, hunger, thirst, etc. We have all seen, unfortunately, that hunger in the world is progressing, while for 40 or 50 years, the number of people suffering from malnutrition had gone down significantly. So it's on the basis of all of these questions that we're being asked, how are we going to work? Why do we work? And will we have new possibilities, new means? As Aristotle said, the goal of a society is to be happy, is happiness. What we should be looking for is happiness. Aristotle was right, doubtless. How can we reach this happiness? How can we best negotiate our capacities? I thought you were going to continue. Thank you. That's a very good beginning. I was just a little surprised. Let's continue with you. Alexandre FRETTI from Malte, the group with a different viewpoint. We're going to ask you how you develop this company culture. It's the question of the time with the development of remote working, with more and more freelance workers. When we were preparing this discussion, you saw that there was an increasing demand from your customers in support functions. They're looking for outside employees. So how do we recreate this link in the context? I'm not going to go back up to hunting and gathering, but if we go back to the beginning of the 20th century, before the Industrial Revolution, workers were called dailies. They carried out tasks in exchange for pay, and the pay was on a day scale. That they were the ancestors of freelancers. And what's quite funny in the story of slavery is that employment was pushed by employers who wanted more reliable workers, and the future employees were worried that they would be forced into slavery. So this is an interesting viewpoint, because today we're living in a world of really wages as salaried employees. There are more freelance workers, but 80% of workers are still salaried employees in France. And for the 3-5 years now, the model has been challenged. What we've lived through, being in contact with freelancers and our employees, we have 500 employees at Malte. We don't believe in a full team of freelancers. People are looking for meaning. People are looking to work less. They want to have 4-day week in our company. But nevertheless, if we look at this, if we stand back a bit, we realize that we've entered into a world of the employee consumer. An employee has rights and duties, and when we employ freelancers, the freelancers become more autonomous. So some employees, they have the right to do some remote working, to take holidays at certain times. There are certain things that are given to me individually that were not given to me in the past. Nevertheless, for some people that's not enough, and they move on to freelancers to be fully independent. So how do you create company culture in this? We're convinced we need salaried employees. It's thanks to salaried employees that we have a deep knowledge of the company, that we can engage in the long term and embody the company culture, and that's key. And these debates on remote working seem fundamental. We see today that there are company models that are developing on 100%. You can work wherever you are across the world. Some retrograde companies, you saw Elon Musk's tweet, who wanted to reduce his headcount and asked everyone to come back to the on-site. The world is a hybrid world now, and the companies that succeed are the ones who can manage individual desires and the interest of the collective. And for remote working as such, it's an improvement of individual performance, but it's not always an increase in collective performance. It increases individual efficiency. So I think the hybrid model is going to work in the future. Freelancers work like companies of the future. Freelancers already had these debates that we're having now. We've discovering that employees now want to work differently, and freelancers were already working in a hybrid model. Many of them like to work on their customers' sites, really enjoy it. So this model is very interesting. And when you run a company, I have employees who want to go too far in the autonomy, and I say, put yourself in my shoes. What's the interest? What's the return on investment of having someone who I never see, who has a distant link with the company, who wants a lot of personal advantages but no real duties towards the company? And I compare that with a freelance who's going to be more committed to the company with a real mission. And that question is being asked. It's not obvious for the employee, the freelancer, or the head of the company. Thank you for that comment. We're online with Sergei GURIEV, whom I presented earlier, an economist, head of research at Sciences Po. I think you have an audio connection. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Hello?
On va parler avec vous des métamorphoses.
We're going to talk about how work is changing, the metamorphosis of work. And is there a before and after COVID for you? And if yes, and how is this working?
Yes, thank you very much. And indeed, Maya, Thierry, and Alexandre already laid the ground for what's going on right now, what's happened before. And I fully agree with Maya that there are major factors that drive job polarization related to globalization, automation, the rise of precarious jobs. And before COVID, we thought that these are major challenges for our society. And we thought about the need for reskilling, upskilling, providing continuous education. But we also thought about universal basic income. And COVID has taught us a lot, because COVID has become a very important natural experiment that we didn't expect, we didn't prepare for, and we learned a lot during COVID. So what has changed and what will remain the same after the COVID? So one thing which we clearly see is that labor market polarization will not disappear. It is driven by factors which are factors that I mentioned and then Maya described so well, that are here to stay, and therefore the labor market polarization, the growth and inequality will not disappear. If anything, we saw how during COVID, people with skill, highly skilled people, people with university degrees have been doing relatively well, while people with lower education actually suffered both in terms of health and also in terms of their access to economic opportunities. And in that sense, COVID just reinforced the inequality that we were talking about. Now, a lot of people would say virus doesn't understand whether a person is rich or poor. So the virus should be the great equalizer, great leveler, but that's not what we observe. Yes, viruses don't treat people differently, but people can protect themselves in a differential way. Richer people, better educated people could continue working from home. They had bigger houses, better internet connections, And in that sense, COVID just re-emphasized how important it is for us to think about labor market polarization and inequality. Now, another great experiment was that many countries, unlike 10 years ago during the Euro crisis, this time around, many countries were extremely generous in their fiscal support. And in essence, many countries essentially trialed UBI, universal basic income. In many countries, people who sat at home were paid to sit at home because we wanted to slow down the spread of the virus. So we actually just paid money to people who didn't work, and we told them, don't go to work.
Monsieur Guriev, pardon de vous interrompre. Je suis désolée. Excusez-moi, vous m'entendez, monsieur?
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Guriev. Can you hear us? I'm sorry to interrupt you. The connection's not very fluid, and it's not very easy for us to understand. I'm very sorry about that. Maybe we can improve our connection with you. It was very difficult to understand what you were saying, and people in the room are nodding, agreeing. So hopefully we can get a better connection with you and we can come back to you. We apologize for this interruption, but it was very difficult to hear you and understand what you were saying. We'll try to improve the connection and get back to you. Mr. HOMMERIL, who's the president of the CFE, CGC, the president of the executives unions. So what do you observe in terms of changes in companies to the consumer employee? Does this speak to you, or would you say that it's a logical evolution? Thank you for your invitation. I'd like to say two things. Firstly, it's obvious that today what we can call is the balance of power has changed. I'll give you a very well-known example. Today, in a job interview, people who recruit, they'll all tell you this. 10 years ago, I was interviewing people I wanted to hire. Now, I'm being interviewed by potential employees. And this indicates a change, a movement that's not going to change in the coming months or years. To decode this, I'd like to talk about something that we forgot quickly. It's quite old, but talking about an employee's attachment to their job, what's employment that a person has to the company that they're working for. If we go back to the post-war period, what we were calling paternalism, what was that exactly? It's in big companies that wanted to grow and develop technologies and to invent. They wanted to have motivated employees to be able to develop them along with the company. And that's why in these big companies in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, what did we do? In the branch negotiations, we negotiated for seniority bonuses. Why a seniority bonus? So that people would want to stay in the company, so that after 2 to 3 years, they wouldn't want to go and work in another company saying, this is what I learned in such and such company. I'm better, so I'm going to work for you, but I want to be paid better. That's why you got this seniority bonus. There was also housing assistance in some companies that I worked in. Almost all of the staff was housed. That was an advantage linked to the contract. It was also a way of having a captive market of employees and keeping them in the company. What was under all of this, a person who joined the company, they want to improve, to progress. Not everyone wants to, but it's a natural desire to want to move up the ladder during your career with a diploma or without. You still want to evolve in your career, change categories, become an executive. Why not? This is a career project of one of personal investment, and it's in the grouping of these individual projects and the desire to progress that we allow a company to progress. There's no logic beyond this one. And if we don't bring together this individual will within a company in which there's a return on the collective effort, we will defragment companies. And it seems to me that today we're seeing two things. we're seeing a period that's lasted from the end of the 1980s, 90s, where in the fragmented discourse of companies, they're saying the company wants to optimize their results and costs, but we didn't talk about individuals and what they were contributing to companies, their experiences over the long moment, over the long time, informal relationships between people, social contacts, social interactions. This was necessary. For 2 years, people had to work remotely, but we realize how important it is. This is what creates the value of a company. And in the message, in the discourse for 20 years, this was all minimized. And over time, people became aware of this. And the younger generations who are joining the workforce now, they're the children of a generation that's between 50 and 60 years old that have been through that whole period from the early 90s until today, with company restructuring, the redundancy schemes, and all of the consequences of that. And they hear about this at home, on the radio, and people are talking about it. Now they're joining the labor market, and they're saying, why do I want to invest in a company like this who will probably not to give me much in return in terms of strategy, in terms of visibility for my career? And so I kind of agree with them. On the other hand, that's not without risk, because there is a give-give relationship. What the company can give to someone corresponds to what they're prepared to give back. And you can't just take everything for yourself, work for yourself. I agree with what you had said. I remember when I was 20 years old, people who were doing bibliography were not the most interesting people, but they were doing a very useful job. And I think that all jobs are useful, and experience is vital in order to get the collective to move forward, to progress, and to provide one's own progress to collective progress. But you can't do this alone. Experience is generated by contact with others, by working with others. The coffee break, the little advice that you'll get from an older colleague that you wouldn't have gotten elsewhere.
I think that, Laurent BLANCHARD, you will be able to concur with what has been said. You want to focus on meaning when people work. So within companies, employees should be able to find some meaning with their work. And most of the time, employees and salaried workers are less committed. Whether you are referring to a new or future model. So according to a yardstick, why do I work in a company? So from the 17th place to the 3rd place, just behind wage conditions and working conditions. According to a survey, 40% of young people were eager to leave a company in the first year. So the quest for meaning is pivotal, and the quest for meaning in the company, we managers, we are like hands in front of a knife. So what do we do? A lot of work has been done on corporate social responsibility, and some companies have decided to embrace the topic. Others have paid lip service. But at the end of the day, what am I going to do? Am I going to integrate that concept into the business model? So we need to embark upon an in-depth transformation. We talk about CSR, ESG. So the societal, environmental dimensions should be included in the purpose of a company. It's not complex because it's a matter of measurement. At the end of the day, a company has to perform. So how do we change things? So there are new positions. The chief impact officers, this is a new position. These people will be working with management, and they will support management, in-depth management. So the quest for a meaning is clear. Then managers, what should they be doing? I'm not going to revisit all the managerial models that we're familiar with, but we became managers because it was the only way for people to develop themselves. It is either you take it or you leave the company. So regarding the quest for meaning, we need to revisit that question. Do I want to be a manager? And if I want to be a manager, am I ready to do what is fundamental? I mean, to work on myself. For example, you have a manager who will call the shots, and it will put the pressure upon you, so that's really bad. And you have younger people who are affected by that. So the employees will leave a company because of a poor relationship with their managers. So what is fundamental here is the fact that when you want to be a manager, you want to work on yourself, and then you need to decipher the weak signals in a company. As part of the remote working process, people worked with teams from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. So how can you feel that an employee is doing a good job? This is what I would call a management ecology, i.e. To have a personal tense, to keep abreast of people, to listen to people. So when you take decisions, you have to be swift. But from time to time, you need to take a step back, and you need to keep abreast of people. You need to listen to people. So allow me to echo what you said, Mr. Blanchard. I read a survey by a mental health organization. 43% of managers are feel tired, and they are depressed. And 1/3 of the executives wish they haven't been promoted. Is it something that you've noticed? A lack of commitment? Thierry DEREZ, what do you think of that? A lack of commitment now from managers? I do concur with what has been said, i.e. with remote working, it's very difficult to convey the corporate culture. It's impossible. So when you think that you can disseminate a corporate culture, that's not possible. A company should be imbued with a culture. Diversity is very often highlighted. But I think that we need to foster it, to encourage it in companies. So we need to admit, and this was confirmed during the COVID crisis. So we have to admit that it is impossible to convey this culture, this corporate culture, through modern communication means. There's a sense of impairment, and people will feel increasingly useless. Young candidates will feel in disarray. So there's a reversal of positions. For example, I offer a job, the candidate should make a positive impact, and this is a paradigm shift now. And this is not possible with remote working. The company cannot work with teleworking alone. François HOMMERIL. It's very simple. Have a look at the cooking book and the chef, the 3-star chefs. I mean, I will give you an example, and you will understand the issue of remote working. When you are offered a cooking book at Christmas and there are some great cakes, so you can try to make those cakes, but it will be a daunting challenge. But in all jobs, in all professions, that's the case. In all jobs and professions, I mean, there's an excellent way of doing things. And of course, it's a learning curve. It's a learning process. So learning is not only a matter of school status. I mean, you are still learning when you work. So in all the French restaurants, imagine there were pastry chefs and chefs who learned to make cakes by watching tutorials on YouTube. You wouldn't get good cakes, and the same applies to companies. And I think that it's an issue that will continue in the long haul. But is it inexorable or not? I mean, do you think that we can backtrack? I haven't said that it was inexorable. We need to strike a balance. That's important. And you have to take into account the aspirations of young people, because young people are at stake, and we'll have to build this fresh equilibrium. Back to the example of a cooking book. We cannot imagine transmitting, conveying a culture, but we are primates, and we learn by imitating. So that's the way we learn in most cases. So if we are deprived of this ability to imitate, we won't learn much. So I think that our standards will be eroded progressively. So our standards, our levels will be impaired. And I don't think that it bodes well for the future in the light of the challenges that we have to take up. Allow me to chip in following what you've said. Problems for managers. If you want to be a manager, it's a colossal challenge. You have young people, young generations who will explain to you that there's some inconsistency between private life and professional life, and I can tell you that I've experienced that situation because I grew up in this managerial environment. So it's not possible to sort out this problem. So we need to help and support the managers, and if they need to pause, they should be able to pause, and they need to be supported when it comes to managing these kinds of relationships, because what is important is to understand the situation. There is nothing worse than not being able to understand the situation. So we need to understand the underpinnings. For example, a manager will ask for help, and this is something that people don't accept. A manager needs help, especially when I have a problem with my employees in terms of commitment. This is what is at stake. Alexandre FRETTI, you wanted to chip in. So it's a kind of panel discussion that it's a bit conservative because we see eye to eye on the issue, but we the initial question was about the role of managers regarding commitments. I think that people should be well trained. Managers should be well trained. And the bottom line is that managerial courage is not well conveyed. So the manager is between the devil and the deep blue sea. You have a company eager to get some performances, and you have employees, they leave and they go to another company, and they will leave a boss. So the middle managers are at a loss. You have this notion of managerial courage. When you recruit a manager, you need a courage, heart, skills, and competencies. So it's very easy to decipher and to spot skills, but to spot the heart of people is much more difficult. I think that we have 15 minutes ahead of us, so I think that I will give you the floor, you in the audience. So go ahead. I mean, is it possible to give him or her a mic? So a mic, is there a roving mic? Or maybe the Q&A session is a bit premature now? So, Mike, is it possible to give a mic? So, thank you for your observations. I'm one of the old guard, and I left the corporate world 15 years ago. At that time, people were talking about predictive management of skills and jobs. And then the companies were tasked to prepare this moment to train people. I think that artificial intelligence will undermine jobs in the banking sector, in the automotive sector. So what can you tell us? What is your take on that, please? François HOMMERIL, you seem to be very inspired. So the more we speak about it, the less we do. This is my hunch. I'm 60 years of age. have experienced many developments and evolutions. So people have been talking about predictive management of skills and jobs, but it is not really forthcoming. In some companies, I mean, GPEC, predictive management of skills and companies, was a process, and people were supported, but it implies a cost. You need to anticipate, and many businesses and companies have a stance, but they don't turn words into deeds. But that's a problem. It's a problem of economic competitiveness. We talked about experience. What is important is to garner experience, and there will be economic competitiveness, and I'm worried for the years to come. If you consider the current conditions, I mean, people feel less committed to a company, and it means that people will have fewer skills and competencies, and they will be less attached to a company. They won't relate to the company, and there will be a loss of competitiveness. So competitiveness doesn't boil down only to the income statement, but what is also important is the ability of workers through their commitment to the corporate project that will imply that the company will be able to move ahead and to develop itself. Maya, the impact of digitalization covers many sectors. Some sectors are more impacted than others, but digitalization will have an impact on many jobs and professions, especially routine tasks within each profession. So that's where the shoe pinches. So, of course, it's not a matter of focusing on the job level. What is important is to take into account digitalization, how digitalization will impact jobs and tasks. So does the digital industry destroy jobs? But I think that there's no issue, because we have digital technologies and they will fast-track transformation. But conversely, you have digital technologies, but what do they do? You've talked about artificial intelligence. So digital technologies will automate specialized, so-called specialized activities. Let's take the example of algorithms. So we provide solutions for accountants, so that invoice digitalization is automated. Are we going to destroy jobs? Yes, potentially, but we will enable some people, some workers, to provide a genuine, full-fledged service to customers. So the digital technology will unleash human potential, and basically workers and employees will focus on more general matters. Thierry DEREZ, of course, I do understand what you said. And it is in line with your question, sir. You have to consider inequalities. So when we say that digital technologies will help these professions, the accountants, the doctors, the bankers, or the car manufacturers, i.e. value will be more important in terms of business activities. Of course, this will have an impact. But what about the others? The others will be left on the sidelines. But I think that we have to wake up to the fact. People have said digital technologies are great. We have to be careful with that. When you introduced the topic, you briefly talked about the importance, relevance of the middle class. Middle classes are the lifeblood of a democracy. A democracy without a middle class is in a predicament. The days will be numbered. So I'm not quite sure that digital technologies will foster the emergence, the development of a middle class. So what is at stake here is not simply economic challenges. It's not simply a matter of getting a good income statement. I mean, these are overall challenges for a society as a whole. If you consider the automotive industry, to make an electrical engine, you need 2 workers. In order to repair a thermal car with hundreds and hundreds of parts. You need a lot of specialties. You need time and to repair an electrical vehicle. I mean, you need to change the battery, that's all. So I think that I've summed it all. So, Arnaud Bangloff, IKEA. So you talked about moderating regarding remote working, hybridization, but what about work organization? So hybridization, is it organized? I mean, we've noticed that there are some limitations to that. People are talking about working time and the square meters that you will occupy. So with remote working, there are some assets, but there are some limitations as well. So we need to come up with a moderate hybridization. So what is your take on that? So how do you organize work as leaders, as corporate leaders? But there are some jobs that are not tailored to remote working. So what do you think of that? We've made a choice. We have 500 workers. The average age is 30, so there's a high pressure. People want to work remotely. But of course, we provide some guidelines. We don't impose anything. So 3 days at work or 2 days at home. So if you are a developer, your added value will be reduced, especially if you are a developer. And how do we make sure that people come to the office for 3 days? You have to think about managerial exemplarity. So we are strong believers. We are convinced that people should come to the office, and we're convinced about that, because when you hire somebody who is 23, 24, 25, these young people, they want to be trained, and they want to go to the office by watching the other colleagues. And you have some people who prefer remote working because they have 6 or 7 years of experience, and for them it's not necessary to go to work. When you have a top manager who organizes a meeting next to the beach, it's very difficult to make sure that there's a sense of appropriation by people. So when I joined my company, had my traditional background, I said 3 days at the office and 2 days at home. But we were on a collision course. The head office is at Rue Saint-Denis in Paris, and it was full of employees. So people are very happy to get back to work, to get back to the office, and it's complex if it's a constraint. So Thierry Derez, do you share that observation? Yes, but allow me to qualify. So the average age is 43 in our company. So I think that regarding this topic, we are not as smart as you are, but there are some employees who can work remotely, but there are some people who cannot do some remote working. And for us, 25% of people can do remote working. So we've managed to strike a balance. So 3 days at the office and 2 days at home. But there's a nuance, but it depends on the age average of people. So we said it's not good to work remotely on Monday and on Friday. I haven't understood why, but I will turn to my HR manager. Why these 2 days have been ruled out instead of being promoted? That's weird. So Arnaud, To answer your question, I think that we are just at the start of the remote working in terms of impact on work organization. So 2 days of remote working a week, but there are rules that are very difficult to apply. I mean, stop organizing meetings in Zoom meetings in different rooms. So try to use the traditional ways of working, i.e. make sure that people have a cup of coffee together. And I think that people manage the company according to the results. So do you agree with that? Yes, I do. But after the war in the United States, in IT&T, a communication company, there was one of the biggest strikes when the switchboard operating procedures were automated. So it was one of the biggest strikes in the US. And in the 2000 an academic has computed the number of phone flows that would be necessary, and he said that twice the population of the United States. Maya, maybe you would like to conclude? Yes, I will conclude. So thank you for these debates. Very fruitful debates and discussions. I mean, there are a few avenues for politicians. So the end of salaried work. So if it were to be the end of salaried work, so basically we won't be back to the daily workers. I mean, daily workers who are not integrated and where there is no social dialogue. And France has decided to focus on this new status. Platform workers, are they salaried workers? Are we going to create a specific status? No. And I think that France has embarked upon a specific avenue to create rights for some platform workers. So there were some elections for representatives of private taxi drivers. So, how do we transform rights? This is what is at stake. There's a second point that is pivotal. Why is it the end of salaried work? In economics, you have a firm, you have a market, and we pit the firm against the market, and people will join a company for the corporate culture. It's a matter of identity. So if you don't have a corporate identity, so what about political identity within communities? And last point, what about the school system? How do we train? Who do we train? If we don't train people for the labor world. So accomplishment is important. And back to Aristotle, work through accomplishment and through personal development. Thank you for your insights. Thanks a lot.